Hey everyone, this is Precog from Headphones.com, and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the Arya V3, the stealth magnet iteration which clocks in at $1,600. Now, it's interesting to me because I actually have only heard the bottom and the top ends of Hi-Fi Man's lineup. So I've heard the Sundara and the Susvara, both of which sort of impressed upon me as being the best options in their respective price ranges. Although of course there's not much competition at $6,000 where the Susvara is. So for this reason alone, I've been very excited to take a stab at what I think about one of their mid-tier headphones. Full disclosure, this unit was provided for review by Headphones.com. As always, what follows are my own thoughts and opinions to the best of my ability. Let's dive right into the review. Alright, let's dive into the legendary unboxing experience of the Arya. Psych. The unboxing experience consists of the headphones and a cable. That's it. That said, you won't hear me complaining just because I normally do not give much time to these things anyways, and we're going to be able to get through this faster than usual. So starting with the cable, I've heard a lot of complaints about Hi-Fi Man's cables in the past. With that being said, I don't really have any issues with this cable. It's a little springy, it's a little bit thin, but I don't necessarily think it's like unusable from a functional perspective. Moving to the Arya itself, I generally think that this is a well-designed headphone. I like that this has this like double headband sort of thing, where this is actually the frame and then this is what you would adjust on your head. Just be aware that because this is technically the frame, it's always going to rest above your head a little bit. And to demonstrate, let me put these on. And you're gonna have this going on over your head. That's definitely more of an aesthetics thing, but I think it's worth pointing out if that is something that concerns you. In terms of the comfort, the Arya V3 I found to be a very comfortable headphone. This is mainly just thanks to the very large egg-shaped cups, which completely envelope your ears. Like, I don't think your ears even touch it. A more small niggle that I would maybe point out is that it does tend to put a little bit more strain on your jaw just because of how large they are. The only real concern that I would point out is that the build quality on this headphone is just acceptable in my opinion. Especially for $1,600, I think I would say that I expect a little bit better. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, they have anodized the frame of this headphone, but with the way this mechanism works, it scrapes against the anodization and it'll leave behind the bare aluminum. I do find that to be a bit of a strange oversight, and I really wish they would have just left the bare aluminum to mitigate this sort of uncanny contrast to some degree. Something else that I'll point out, and again this is more of an aesthetic thing, is that I believe it's the stealth magnets inside, they don't align parallel with the frame of the headphone. Okay, so when it comes to the actual sound of the Arya V3, Hi-Fi Man, to me at least, has just a very clear idea in their mind of what music should sound like on a headphone. And I say this in the sense that almost all of their headphones followed a very similar frequency response that is basically a more thin, more analytical version, I guess, of the Harman Target. And I will throw up the frequency response on screen so that you guys can take a look. Basically, this is just a very solidly tuned headphone overall. There are some minor issues here and there, but as a whole, I think that this is a very, very well-tuned headphone. So starting with the bass, it is basically flat between the mid-bass and the sub-bass, down to around maybe like 30 hertz or so. Right under that, I think it's a little bit more questionable, but the extension is just very good overall. And I would really need to use like sine sweeps and have music that tokens that low to know for sure just how deep it goes into the sub-bass. But it goes very low, and it goes noticeably lower than a lot of open back dynamic driver headphones like the Sennheiser stuff and the Focal stuff. The cleanliness of bass notes, especially on quicker stuff, is also quite good just because the sub-bass and the mid-bass are linear with one another, and the mid-bass isn't masking the sub-bass as it is on a lot of, again, open back dynamic driver headphones. If the Arya V3 draws the short end of the stick in bass for any reason, it would be for its bass texturing and its slam characteristics. Bass notes in general, they just sound a little bit dry, a little bit poofy, I think is the best way to describe it. They don't hit very hard, and that's probably the biggest critique that I can level at the Arya V3. If you think I'm being unfair, then I think a good point of comparison would be Odyssey's headphones. From memory, I believe that Odyssey's headphones slammed just a little bit harder in the bass, as well as they had better control. But yeah, pretty solid bass response overall, just not best in class for a planar. I think Odyssey's stuff is better. Not to go off on a tangent, but if you've heard some of Odyssey's stuff, like the LCD-I4, the LCD-2, that stuff, then you know that the mid-range on their headphones is, at least those headphones, is generally not that great. And I think that the mid-range is a strength of the Arya V3. The only real issue that I would point out with the Arya V3's mid-range is a little bit of a recession at around 1 to 2 kHz. And what this does is it cuts out some of the some of the richness to male vocals. They don't sound quite as chesty as they should, but it's a very small niggle, and I think another small niggle would be just a tad too much emphasis at around maybe 3 to 4 kHz for my preferences. Trailing S consonances can be a little bit sharp at times, especially if you have a poorly mastered track. Overall, I would consider this to be a thin, neutral mid-range done correctly. I have heard a lot of mid-ranges within the context of headphones, and Hi-Fi Man's mid-range tuning is up there with some of the best. The only one that I think I would put ahead of it is probably the Sennheiser HE1. That thing has the close to the perfect mid-range that I've heard within headphones, but I digress. Okay, moving into the treble though, this is where my biggest issue with the Arya V3 lies. It is definitely something of a double-edged sword, at least to me, in the sense that 5 to 10 kHz is generally fairly smooth, if not elevated, but then at around 13 to 14 kHz, I hear a spike in the upper treble registers. Personally, it's just a little bit too much for me, and it lends to some timbre issues up top, wherein cymbals, snaps, and stuff of that nature sound a little bit metallic. That said, I want to make clear that this is just for me, and that HRTF varies a great deal after 10 kHz. There's a very good possibility that if you're an older listener or someone who doesn't have 21-year-old ears like myself, that it is going to sound perfectly fine. In fact, it's probably going to sound awesome just because a lot of headphones don't have as much air up top, and by extension detail, perception of detail, that the Arya V3 does. Okay, so speaking of which, technicalities. Generally, I would say that the Arya V3 is within the realm of very good overall. Especially for sheer clarity, the leading sharpness of notes, it is a top performer in my opinion for $1,600. Notes just sound very fleshed out, and in addition to its excellent frequency response, it just sounds like it's able to capture every and any surface level detail in a given track. That being said, when it comes to its reverb trails and maybe its decay, I do find that it's a little bit more lacking. Decay does generally come off a tad truncated, so you're losing that sense of texture that some dynamic driver open backs are able to deliver. For imaging and soundstage, I would say that the Arya V3 is very good again. It sounds fairly open, instruments sound well localized, and I really just don't have any qualms to pick on that front. For macro contrast and slam, I alluded to it a bit earlier, but it is not the most explosive headphone, I guess, for gradations and volume. It does tend to come across maybe a little bit overly loud on less compressed music. It's definitely worth noting that this perception might just be baked purely into frequency response. After all, the Arya V3 does have a leaner, more strident presentation, so to speak. It's a bit brighter and it can be fatiguing at times. And just as a consequence, I find myself turning down the volume by default. Okay, so the topic that I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for me to cover, the Arya V3 versus the Arya V2. What is the difference? Well, I'm sure you're going to tire of me saying it in the next couple of minutes, but to sum it up, the difference between them is very small. They are, for the most part, very much the same headphone. Like, if I had to throw out an arbitrary number, like 90% the same headphone. In terms of frequency response, the Arya V2 is generally described, at least in my opinion, as being maybe a more laid-back, warm listen. It has less 3 to 5 kHz, it has a little bit less sub-bass, and most noticeably, it has less upper treble at around 13 to 14 kHz. So the biggest difference that you're really going to notice between the Arya V2 and the Arya V3 is that the Arya V2 is a little bit warmer, it's a little bit more forgiving of music. So in terms of technical performance, especially with respect to soundstage, as I know there's a lot of discourse that sort of claims that the Arya V2 is better at staging, whereas the Arya V3 is more closed in. I'm going to say that they are very close, but yes, the Arya V2 is a little bit more expansive. It does sound like it has a little bit more soundstage height to it, so the overall presentation is a little bit more grand, a little bit more diffuse. But again, do take note of my use of the word a little. It's just a little bit here, a little bit there. And in fact, I would say that the Arya V3 has sharper imaging than the Arya V2. It might just be because instruments are placed a little bit more up front on the Arya V3, but they are definitely sharper and it is easier to discern where instruments are coming from on the stage on the Arya V3. Likewise, for a sense of clarity, the Arya V3 wins out over the Arya V2. Again, just by a smidge, and it also has better slam characteristics where it sounds like the music is sort of attacking at you and feeling alive. In essence, what I'm getting at is that there's really no clear-cut winner, at least for me, between the Arya V2 and the Arya V3. And I know cop-outs suck, but I think that this is a distinction, a nuance that a lot of listeners are going to have to come to terms with when they're deciding between these two headphones and which is the one for them. So again, the Arya V2 if you're after a more laid-back, warm presentation, and then the Arya V3 if you're after a more high-clarity upfront presentation. At the end of the day though, I don't think you can really go wrong with either of them. And the Arya V3 is just a very solid headphone overall. The closest point of comparison outside of the Arya V2, of course, is going to be the Sennheiser HD800S. Head to head, I do think from memory that the HD800S has a small edge in resolution and soundstage. However, I do think that the Arya V3's tonality is more desirable. It simply has better bass extension and its treble response. While it does have its own aberrations to it, it is overall, I think, a better treble response than what the 800S exhibits. With the use of EQ, I think I could see it going either way, but at least for me, for my personal preferences, the Arya V3 would be my pick at roughly $1,600. And yeah, I think that's gonna do it for my thoughts on the Arya V3. Again, I have to commend Hi-Fi Man for just being a very consistent brand. That's not something you see a lot of in the audio world. It just seems like a lot of brands have a lot of hits and they have a lot of misses. It's one or the other. But with Hi-Fi Man, you know exactly what you're getting, and yeah, just very solid stuff overall. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.